Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our July Electric Vehicles 101 webinar. It's now just a little bit after noon, so I'll go ahead and get started. If you could do me a favor and write in a note in the chat if you can hear me and if the audio is clear, that would be a huge help to me. But since I already see a whole bunch of attendees, I'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Anna Vanderspeck. I am the Electric Vehicle Program Director at Green Energy Consumers Alliance. Green Energy Consumers Alliance is actually a nonprofit organization based out of Boston and Providence. And we've run an electric vehicle program called Drive Green in Massachusetts and Rhode Island for a couple of years. You're hearing from me on a National Grid webinar because National Grid has hired us to do the education and outreach for its electric vehicle program in upstate New York called Drive Green with National Grid, which we'll talk about a little bit more further in this presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. The phone number that's listed here and at the end of the presentation is my work extension, which is currently unstaffed because we are all working from home. But if you call there and leave a message, I'll be sure to call you back because I'll get a recording of the voicemail. Some quick webinar logistics. Everyone is muted to avoid background noise, but just in case you manage to unmute yourself, please double check that your microphone is muted. We'll have regular breaks for questions. This presentation is broken up into three parts. In the first, I'll talk about why electric vehicles are a good idea, both for society writ large and also individual consumers. In the second, I'll talk about some important things you need to know about electric vehicles if you're thinking about maybe getting one. And then in a third section, I'll talk about how to get one if you're interested. If at any point in the presentation you have a question, please feel free to write it into the chat or questions box that you should see right in your GoToWebinar panel. And then I'll stop between those sections to answer any questions that have come up. With that, I'll jump right into the first section, which is why electric vehicles. So in this section, I'll start in the big picture. And for us, the big picture first is the environmental benefits of electric vehicles. Right now, across the country, but also specifically in New York, the transportation sector is now the largest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions, and those are those emissions that cause climate change. We've done a pretty good job over the past couple of decades of bringing down emissions from the electricity generation sector. Now there is the transportation sector to work on next. I'll pause real quick because I see a couple of notes on sound. I've heard from a couple of you that the sound is good. Some of us can't hear anything, so let me just quickly write a note. If you can't hear anything, try calling in on a phone, although I suppose if I'm saying that out loud, it's not really required if you can hear me. So bear with me just a moment as I respond to this. Okay, thank you for bearing with me for that pause. So as I was saying, the environmental benefits are the first big picture benefit of of electric vehicles. A lot of people have a conception of electric vehicles that they're just as bad as gas-powered cars because of the state of our electric grid. But that's really actually not the case. So to highlight that, we point to data from the Union of Concerned Scientists that has an excellent tool where you can plug in any zip code in the country, and it'll show you the average emissions of a gas-powered car, a plug-in hybrid, or a battery electric vehicle. If you're thinking about a specific car, you can even plug in specific vehicles to check their carbon dioxide emissions. But basically, as you can see illustrated on this graph, switching from a gas-powered car to a plug-in hybrid or battery electric dramatically brings down your greenhouse gas emissions. And that decrease will actually only get bigger as time moves on as we add more renewables and zero-emission generation sources onto our electric grid. So if you switch from an average gas-powered car, which emits about 381 grams of carbon dioxide emissions per mile driven, to a plug-in hybrid, you can cut your emissions by more than half. A plug-in hybrid is a vehicle that has a battery that you can charge up through a plug in the wall, but also has a backup gas tank that kicks in if the battery gets depleted. So some popular plug-in hybrids right now are the Toyota Prius Prime, which is distinguished from the traditional Prius in that it does have a plug that you can charge up via a wall outlet. Some others you might have heard of are the Mitsubishi Outlander plug-in hybrid, which is one of the larger SUVs. And there's the ever popular Chevy Volt with a V as in Victor. That's also a plug-in hybrid. If you go all the way to a battery electric vehicle, this is a car that has only a battery on wheels. It's basically a battery and a fancy computer on wheels. With no backup gas tank. There you can cut your emissions nearly all the way down to zero, from 381 to just over 50 grams of carbon dioxide emissions per mile. And that's a really incredible jump, because nowhere else in your life is it generally that easy to make that big of an impact by switching out one technology. Along with those carbon and climate benefits come public health benefits that are particularly crucial to underline right now. So when an electric vehicle is driving on electricity, there are no tailpipe emissions. So a pure battery electric vehicle never has any tailpipe emissions. A plug-in hybrid will have tailpipe emissions only when it's driving on gasoline. But even if you take into account how the electricity is generated that you plug in and fuel up with, electric vehicles are responsible for much fewer of the pollutants that are causing real damage to people's health. So a traditional gas-powered car emits all sorts of pollutants that are causing real harm to people's brains and hearts and lungs. I'm thinking of things like NOx and SOx emissions, so sulfur and nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, ground level ozone. All of these things are pollutants that cause and exacerbate things like asthma, emphysema. They're related to strokes and heart conditions, and they're causing real damage across the country. So we point to a 2016 study from the American Lung Association, where at the time they studied the 10 states that had electric vehicle targets or requirements or goals. And they tried to calculate what the externalities of burning gasoline for transportation were in just those 10 states for just 1 year. So basically looking at the climate change impacts and the public health impacts of burning gasoline, impacts that we're paying for elsewhere in our system, in the healthcare system, but not paying for at the pump. So for just those 10 states, for just 1 year, they calculated $37 billion in climate and health costs for 1 year, which amounted then to about $1.15 per gallon that we're not paying for at the pump, but paying for elsewhere. So the more that we transition from gas-powered cars to electric vehicles, the lower these costs will come, and more importantly, the lower the human suffering will come. Right now, as we're in the middle of a pandemic, there have been plenty of studies already that show that COVID stays in the air longer in places that are more polluted because there are more particles that it can latch onto in the air. And people who have been subjected to higher levels of pollution are more susceptible to getting COVID and having complications or more difficult time with COVID when they do get it. So this is really a public health issue. It's a social equity issue, and it's one of the many reasons why electric vehicles are good from a big picture perspective. I also want to highlight that climate change itself is a public health threat. So as the planet warms and we're getting more extreme weather events, there are more and more opportunities for people to get sick, either because they've been displaced from their home or because the zone for vector transmitted diseases has increased. We're seeing this in the Northeast with an explosion of Lyme disease because the winters are not as cold, so there's more and more ticks around. So those things factor into those costs of burning gasoline as well. Why are these cars so much better from a public health and environmental perspective? The answer is efficiency. So gas-powered cars, which are a technology that we have been working on for over 100 years, are at this point only about 20% efficient. So what that means is that 80% of the energy that's stored in 1 gallon of gasoline is getting lost, mostly due to friction and heat when you drive around your gas-powered car. That's a huge amount of loss. Electric vehicles, in contrast, are somewhere between 60 and 80% efficient, which means there's much less loss which means you can go further with much less. One way to look at this and understand it a little bit better is by putting gas-powered cars and electric vehicles on the same scale, on the same graph. And that's what we've done on the right here on this slide. So what we're doing here is we're comparing the miles per gallon efficiency of popular gas-powered cars with the miles per gallon electric of some EVs. Miles per gallon electric is a figure that captures how far you can drive on the amount of energy that's typically stored in 1 gallon of gasoline. And that amount is 33.7 kilowatt hours. So comparing the miles per gallon and the miles per gallon electric allows you to compare electric vehicles and gas-powered cars really apples to apples on the same scale. So what you can see is on the right, gas-powered cars generally get somewhere up to 30 miles per gallon. Then you've got your conventional hybrids like the Toyota Prius and the Hyundai Sonata that get somewhere between 40 to 50. And then you can see that on the left side of the graph, the all-electric vehicles blow everybody else out of the water in terms of efficiency. So a Tesla Model 3, for example, has the equivalent of 130 miles per gallon in terms of its efficiency. And again, those efficiency gains are what drives the environmental and public health benefits we saw in the previous slides. That and the fact that burning gasoline will always produce these pollutants, but electricity can be generated from zero emitting sources. This efficiency is good for the world writ large, but it's also really good for consumers. So I'll transition now into why these vehicles are a good choice for consumers. The first is that electric vehicles have lower fuel costs. This is even true right now with our really low gas prices and the Northeast's relatively high electricity costs compared to other parts of the country. So we look at this two ways. One is that we do our own math every quarter, which you can see right on our website. We publish our methodology doc so that you can check our assumptions and plug in your own numbers. But the last time we did that, which was earlier this month, we found that an electric vehicle driver will save about 3.6 cents per mile driven compared to the average gas-powered vehicle driver. That adds up to about $500 per year. Again, you can check our methodology on our website, but we're pretty comfortable with this math because it compares well with some math that the Union of Concerned Scientists did about a year ago, where they found that the average American driver would save $770 per year. Our estimate is a little bit lower than that, which makes sense because, again, gas prices are really low right now, and the Northeast has higher electricity prices than some other parts of the country. So that's one way of looking at it. The other way is to look at the e-gallon. So the Federal Department of Energy has a tool that they call the e-gallon, where every day they post the average price of gasoline by state and then the average electric e-gallon. I would encourage you to go straight to energy.gov to look at the methodology for this, but the electric e-gallon is basically the Department of Energy's estimate of how much you would have to pay in electricity in your state to drive the same distance that a gallon of gasoline would get you. So there are some assumptions in there about how efficient a vehicle is, both a gas-powered car and an electric vehicle, how much gas prices cost, how much electricity costs, and all that. But it's a nice visual way of thinking about this again, that right now you're paying about $2.20 at the pump, but on an electric vehicle you'd be paying closer to $1.60 in the equivalent. This is also borne out by the experience of tons of electric vehicle drivers that we speak with all the time about the experience of driving electric. What I would encourage you to do is check out our website, because we link to some resources online where you can compare specifically the vehicle you're driving right now and the specific electric vehicle models that you're considering purchasing, so that you can get a more accurate or personalized estimate. But generally this holds true across the board. Along with lower fuel costs, electric vehicles offer maintenance savings, and these are pretty big and exciting. So in an internal combustion engine, there are hundreds of moving parts that can break or corrode or rust out or generally need to be replaced. An electric vehicle, particularly a pure battery electric vehicle that doesn't have an internal combustion engine as well, has many fewer moving parts. And the parts that are there, like the battery and the motor and the electronics, require little maintenance. There's also fewer fluids, so with a pure electric vehicle, you never need to worry about an oil change, for example. And then there are technologies that protect the parts that do move. One I'd like to point to specifically is regenerative braking. So this is a technology where when you're driving in an electric vehicle and you take your foot off of the accelerator, if you have the regenerative feature on, and most of these cars allow you to turn it on when you want and then turn it off when you don't want it. But if you have it on, the car will recognize that you taking your foot off of the accelerator likely means that you want to slow down or come to a stop. So it will slow you down faster than friction would alone, basically by spinning some magnets around the wheels and capture that energy from slowing down and put it back into the battery. So what that does is, one, it extends your range because you're losing less energy to friction, but it also extends the life of your brake pads because you have to rely on the friction brakes less frequently. So that's a win-win, both in terms of range and also maintenance. We have a quote here from one of our electric vehicle drivers who's just so excited that he never has to stop for any of these maintenance things anymore. But I'll point to some studies in the next slides about how this adds up over time. But first, you should know that there are a couple of purchase and lease incentives that you should be aware of that can bring down the upfront costs of electric vehicles. So most people, when they think of electric vehicles, immediately think of some luxury electric vehicles, but there are actually excellent options that aren't luxury vehicles and that are really close to cost parity with gas-powered cars, and then with these incentives are at cost parity or even less than equivalent gas-powered cars. So starting at the top, there is a federal tax credit that is up to $7,500. I say up to because it depends on the battery size of the vehicle. So if you, for example, are interested in the Hyundai Kona EV, which is an SUV, it's all electric, it gets 260 miles per charge. It has a really big battery, so it qualifies for the full $7,500. Toyota Prius Prime, for example, is a plug-in hybrid that gets 25 miles of range per charge and then has a backup gas tank. It has a smaller battery, so its federal tax credit is closer to $4,500. So when you check on our website, we list the federal tax credit for each vehicle, so you can compare and contrast there. The second thing, though, is that it does depend on your tax liability. So if you don't owe $7,500 in federal taxes, the IRS will unfortunately not write you a check for the difference between what you owe and what you qualify for by purchasing an electric vehicle. And you can't carry the value of the tax credit over from one year to the next. One way that lots of people are still capturing the value of that federal tax credit is by leasing. A lot of people lease electric vehicles who would otherwise never have thought about leasing an electric car, and this is one of the reasons why. When you lease, the federal tax credit goes to the leasing agent, basically the dealer's bank, and most of the manufacturers have decided to pass the value of that rebate on to consumers in the form of lower monthly payments. So I'd encourage you to consider leasing if that's maybe something that would apply to you. The last thing you should know about the federal tax credit is that it was set up to jumpstart the electric vehicle industry, and so it was set up with a limit. Once a manufacturer has sold 200,000 electric units in the US, the federal tax credit starts phasing out in a slightly delayed 6-month cycle. Tesla and General Motors have both completed this process, so there is no federal tax credit anymore for Tesla vehicles or General Motors, so specifically Chevrolet. There's no more federal tax credit there, so that's another thing to be aware of. None of the other manufacturers look like they're going to hit that 200,000 unit anytime soon, but we keep an eye on that and update our website as we think that manufacturers might be getting closer. Taking one step towards the more local now from the federal level, the state of New York has a rebate called the Drive Clean rebate, which is administered by NYSERDA. It is an up to $2,000 rebate, again, based on the electric range. So the higher range vehicles qualify for the full rebate. Lower range vehicles qualify for less. It is a point of sale or lease rebate, which means that you can only get it if you are purchasing or leasing at a participating dealership. You can see the full list at NYSERDA's website, but all of the dealerships that are in the Drive Green with National Grid program, which I'll get to a little later, are NYSERDA Drive Clean dealers. And the last thing we should know is that vehicles that have a base MSRP over $60,000 only get a $500 rebate, because the state of New York wants to make sure that these rebates are actually going to people who need them to make the price of the vehicle more affordable. And then finally, there are some special discounts that you can qualify for. One example right now is that if you are a National Grid electric customer, you can get $5,000 off of the 2019 Nissan Leaf, and then $4,000 off of the 2020 model, because National Grid has an arrangement with Nissan North America. You can see more information on special discounts like that on our website at drivegreen.nationalgridus.com. So that was a lot of information, and to kind of tie it all together on the consumer benefits front, we have a simplified total cost of ownership analysis. So I say simplified because this analysis really just includes the upfront costs, the fuel costs, and the maintenance costs over 5 years. It does not include things like dealer fees or depreciation or financing or insurance or taxes, just because we wanted to keep it relatively simple for this presentation. But basically, if you look at the top row, we have the MSRP of a couple of popular cars. On the right, we have the fully gas-powered Toyota RAV4, which starts at $25,850. As a quick side note, there is a plug-in hybrid version of this vehicle coming soon that we're very excited about, but for this analysis, we're looking at the purely gas-powered version. To compare it to an EV, we chose the Hyundai Kona EV because it is also an SUV, it's also all-wheel drive, and it's all electric. And then for good measure, we threw in the Nissan Leaf Plus, which is one of the more popular electric sedans. So in the first row, you see the MSRP, and if you were to just look at the MSRP, it looks like the electric vehicles are more expensive than the Toyota RAV4. But when you take into account either the special manufacturer rebate, the NYSERDA Drive Clean rebate, and the federal tax credit, already the upfront cost of the two electric vehicles is lower or close to the Toyota RAV4. But from there, let's take into account the fuel costs and the maintenance costs. So for fuel costs, we're assuming that you're driving your vehicle 15,000 miles per year. For the two electric vehicles, we're multiplying by the efficiency of the vehicle, which is a figure that we got from the EPA that publishes it for every electric vehicle. And then we're multiplying that by 20 cents per kilowatt hour, which is a good sort of average electricity cost if we're including distribution and supply on your bill for the service area that we're talking about. So if you do that math for the Nissan Leaf Plus and the Hyundai Kona EV, you get to $930 or $810 per year to drive 15,000 miles. For the Toyota RAV4, we're taking that same 15,000 miles, dividing by the miles per gallon, and then multiplying by the price of gas, which was $2.20 when I checked yesterday and redid this math. So that comes out to $12,000 in fuel costs per year. One thing I want to highlight is that we're living in a time with relatively low gas prices right now. So as gas prices increase, the difference between the electric vehicles and the gas-powered car will increase. But historically, one benefit of electric vehicles is that electricity prices tend to be more stable than gas prices. So gas prices fluctuate more steeply and more frequently than electricity prices. So even if the difference isn't necessarily the biggest, you've got the security of knowing that the electricity prices are not likely to jump suddenly the way that gas prices might. Moving on to the next row, we're looking at maintenance costs for 1 year. The figure that we're using here comes from a AAA study, which is one of the few that is looking at maintenance costs across different types of vehicles. And one caveat is that we think these estimates are actually pretty high for electric vehicles. So AAA calculated that the maintenance costs for an electric vehicle are about 6.6 cents per mile driven. So for both the Nissan Leaf Plus and the Hyundai Kona EV, we're just multiplying that by the 15,000 miles. That comes out to $990 per year. When we've given this presentation to rooms with electric vehicle owners, they usually laugh at this point because their maintenance costs have been zero. We're including this here only because AAA is a reputable source that people generally trust, and it's one of the few that compares across the board. But I'll show you some data in a moment to corroborate why we think that's a little bit too high. But for the Toyota RAV4, AAA's estimate for SUVs is 9.6 cents per mile driven. So that brings us to $1,400 per year in maintenance costs for the RAV4. To get to the very bottom row, the total cost of ownership, we're just taking the upfront cost and adding 5 times the annual fuel costs and 5 times the annual maintenance costs, which at the end of the day, you can see that the electric vehicles win out over the Toyota RAV4. So this is meant to just sort of tie together all the concepts we've talked about in the previous slides. I will absolutely share these slides after this presentation so you can play around with the numbers if you'd like to. But this message is really corroborated by the experience of all the electric vehicle drivers that we've spoken with. So I mentioned on the previous slide that those maintenance estimates seem a little high. This is one of the reasons why. The City of New York has a massive fleet of vehicles, and they publish the maintenance cost by vehicle. And when they did this for 2018, and I'm sure they've done it for 2019, and I can find those numbers, the electric vehicles' annual maintenance costs were clearly much lower than the traditional hybrids and also the gas-powered cars. So the Chevy Bolt and the Ford Focus Electric were around $200 to $400 per year. The traditional hybrids were around $1,000, and the gas-powered cars were closer to $2,000 per year. So this is one of the reasons why we think that $990 from the AAA number is kind of high. But we have tons of resources on this topic on our website if you want to dive into this concept more. And then last but not least, on the consumer front, electric vehicles are really fun to drive. And I say that as not a car person myself, because you don't have to wait for the internal combustion to basically have a mini controlled explosion to translate your putting your foot on the accelerator into motion. These cars are really responsive. So when you put your foot down on the accelerator, you are going to zoom forward in a way that you very quickly get used to, and then it feels weird to go back to a gas-powered car. They're also very quiet and are usually decked out with all the bells and whistles that we have come to expect these days. So things like heated seats, heated steering wheel, lane departure assist warnings, things like that. And then the feature of one pedal driving, which is where when you take your foot off of the accelerator, it slows down more than a gas-powered car would, is a feature that lots of electric vehicle drivers actually have come to love, particularly if you're ever stuck in stop-and-go traffic. You can basically keep your foot just on the accelerator and not have to keep switching back and forth to the brake, which makes for a much smoother and more pleasant driving experience. We regularly survey all of the people who've gotten cars through our program and ask them what they thought about the program, what they thought about the car dealerships, and what they think about their car. Generally, they like the program. They're not super excited about car dealerships, but buying a new car is never a fun experience. But 100% of the respondents have always said that they would recommend their car to a friend or neighbor, and most of them never want to go back to a gas-powered car. So I know it's a strange thing to say in COVID times, but if you do ever have a chance to safely and socially distancedly test drive an electric vehicle, if you haven't already, I would highly recommend it. So that brings us to the end of the first section. I will see here if we've gotten any questions. Yes, I will share the slides after this presentation for sure, and you'll also get a recording so that you can listen to it again or share it with friends if you're interested. There's one question about the Nissan Leaf deal. So Nissan North America's strategy historically has been that they do offer special discounts, particularly through utilities. That has been the case for the past several years. I can't speak to exactly what it will look like or if it will exist past August 3rd, which is when the current one expires. But they have been renewing it over the past couple of years. So I'm hopeful that they will. I just can't promise it. But the federal tax credit and the state rebate will definitely still be in place in the coming months. There's a question about charging stations. I will hold on that because that's something we'll talk about in the next section. There's a question on battery longevity and battery replacement costs, and that's one that we get a lot. So the first thing is that the manufacturers have put a lot of work into these batteries and the management system for the batteries, because they know that the number one concern for consumers is that something's going to happen with the batteries. There is some excellent data on real world battery longevity that I can forward in the summary email after this presentation. But basically, Geotab and Fleet Karma, and I can't remember whether Fleet Karma is part of Geotab or the other way around, but they have a data set of about 6,000 electric vehicles and how their battery capacity changed over time. And basically, it looks like there's about a 2.3% decrease in battery capacity per year of driving. So for folks who are less familiar with batteries, the more frequently you use batteries and the more frequently that they're subjected to high heat in particular, the total capacity of the battery goes down over time. So batteries have outperformed our wildest expectations so far with electric vehicles, that they are lasting a really long time. And this is the first study that's really kind of looked at a big data set to figure out what that actually looks like. 2.3% might sound scary off the bat, but over the lifetime of a car, you probably won't notice, particularly if you're looking at one of the all-electric vehicles that has a range of well over 200 miles. Over 10, 15 years, that 2.3% is not actually going to really impact how far you can drive. And the good news is that this is only getting better and better as time goes on. The batteries are getting more sophisticated. The battery management software is getting more sophisticated. And so this is really not a concern. At this point, the batteries will last as long as the lifetime of the car. In terms of battery replacement, this happens very, very, very rarely. The batteries are warranted for 8 years or 100,000 miles. And if anything's going to go wrong with the battery, it's going to happen in those first couple of years. So we feel very comfortable recommending this technology. We're not worried about the batteries causing problems. There's a question about specifics on the Nissan Leaf deal, about the financing requirements. I will get back to you on that. I have to review that myself. There's some questions about charging that I'll hold on to for the next section. There's a question, if you only have National Grid for gas, can you still get the credit? That is another thing that I will double check. Nissan North America has this arrangement with many utilities, so even if you don't have National Grid for gas, you may have it through your electric utility, and I will double check for you whether National Grid's arrangement extends to gas customers. Okay. There's a couple more questions, but I'm going to go through this next section because I think some of them will be addressed there. And then if I haven't answered your question by the time we get to the next break, I'll do it then. So with that, I'll move on to some things you should know if you're thinking about getting an electric car. The first is this idea of range anxiety. A lot of people who are considering an electric car are really worried that the range isn't going to be enough for them. And range anxiety is the name for this fear that you're suddenly going to run out of charge and get stuck. There are a couple of reasons why that really doesn't happen once you get a car. The first is that, as I mentioned, the manufacturers know that this is your worst fear. And so they have put a lot of work into making sure this doesn't happen. So when you're driving an electric car, at all times, the car will be telling you how much range you have left. So the cars usually say a minimum range, a likely range, and then a high range of how much you have left. So you're never going to suddenly realize you only have 10 miles of charge left, because at all times the car is telling you you can drive another 176 miles before you need to charge, or another 230, or whatever it is. And the manufacturers have made these systems really sophisticated. So they're taking things into account like the temperature, because batteries don't like extremes. They don't like very, very cold weather or very, very hot weather. So as the temperature changes, the software will take that into account when it's calculating an estimate for you. And then some of these cars, it'll even take into account how you drive. So if the car has learned that you are a really aggressive driver who accelerates needlessly a lot and then slams on the brakes a lot, it will know that you're using the battery capacity less efficiently, and it'll adjust your estimate down. But if it knows that you are a gentle driver who really takes advantage of regenerative braking, for example, it'll adjust those estimates up. So you can be confident that at all times you'll know how far you can still drive. The second thing is that the electric range of the vehicles that are available today really goes much beyond what most people drive in a day. So most people drive somewhere between 30 and 50 miles per day. Most of the all-electric vehicles that are available now have over 200 miles of range per charge. And then if you regularly drive more than 200 miles per day, or are just nervous, or want to be able to do lots of longer road trips without ever having to stop to charge, there are some excellent plug-in hybrid vehicles available where, for example, if you get the Toyota Prius Prime, you can do most of your daily driving on electricity, but then when you do have to go on a longer road trip, you do still have that backup gas tank for security. So there really are options that match what most people are looking for in a car today. The second big concern that people have is about charging, how it works. Often when I give these presentations, the first question that people ask is, how long does it take to charge? My favorite way to answer that has become the way that one of our EV ambassadors, who's been driving an electric car for years, answered once when I was at an event, and what he said is it takes a couple seconds, because the experience for most electric vehicle drivers is that they come home or arrive at work if they have charging available at work. They plug in, that takes about 5 seconds. Then they go about their day or their evening, and then when they come back to their car and need to drive somewhere, they just unplug and the car is ready to go. So I would encourage you to think about refueling an electric vehicle more like you would think about recharging your cell phone, where when you're somewhere near a plug, you plug in, and you generally want to keep it somewhere between 50 and 80% full. And think of it more like that and less like a gas-powered car where you have to actually actively go somewhere to refuel on a regular basis. So with that sort of paradigm shift in mind, there are 3 basic levels of electric vehicle charging. The first is called level 1. It's also called trickle charging because it's the slowest. And it adds about 4 miles of range per hour spent charging. That sounds really slow off the bat, but I would encourage you to not dismiss it immediately, because for some people it's actually more than enough. So if you're driving 40 miles a day and you have 10 hours at night to plug in your car, you can refuel what you've used in a day just using a level 1 trickle charge. So for some people that really is enough. Many people have opted to move up 1 level, which is to level 2 charging. This is at 240 volts, and it adds somewhere between 10 and 25 miles of range per hour spent charging. How much depends on which car. Some cars just charge faster than others. This is the type of charging that you may see at your workplace, or if you live at an apartment building or a condo complex where National Grid has helped install some charging stations for you, there are going to be level 2 charging stations. But if you are a homeowner and you want to install this at home, that's also something you can do very easily. The unit itself you can purchase online or at a home improvement store like Lowe's or Home Depot. And then you just need a 240 volt line, which is the same kind of line that you would have for an all-electric dryer, for example. And then you just need an electrician to hook those up. So level 1 and level 2 you can use at home, and level 2 is what you see largely when you see public charging, which I'll talk about a little bit more as well. The third level is called DC fast charging. DC stands for direct current. This is the closest to the experience of stopping at a gas station and fueling up very quickly. So these are the types of stations that are popping up increasingly along major travel corridors at rest stops and things like that. You can get 90 miles of range in 30 minutes on a Chevy Bolt. Some of the Teslas can get up to 120 miles of range in 30 minutes of charging, but this is the type of charging that you would use if you're going on a road trip. So if you're driving somewhere that's more than the range of your car, you might stop, charge for half an hour, get a cup of coffee, use the bathroom, and then when you're ready and have finished your break, you've got another set of miles to go before the next charge. So those are the three basic levels. In terms of plug types, Tesla, first of all, has its own proprietary charging network and their own proprietary ports. So if you drive a Tesla vehicle, you use Tesla chargers. Non-Tesla vehicles cannot use Tesla chargers. Everybody else uses the same standard for level 1 and level 2 charging. It's called the J1772 port. You can see it in the top right-hand corner of the screen. But basically what that means is, regardless of what vehicle you're driving, you can plug into a public level 1 or level 2 charging spot. If you're driving a Tesla, there is an adapter that you can buy to be able to use the J1772, but there's no reverse adapter. So if you're not driving a Tesla, you can't buy an adapter to be able to use the Tesla charging network. So that's just one heads up. It gets slightly more complicated for DC fast charging, where the industry has been split with American and European manufacturers using the SAE combo, which is the figure in the middle, and Asian manufacturers using the CHAdeMO. What that means is, if you're driving along and you need to DC fast charge, you just have to make sure that you are going to a station that has the right plug for your car. The very good news is that most DC fast charging stations have plug types for each type, so you just have to make sure that you're picking the right one up to plug into your car. The only time where that's not true is if you're using a DC fast charging station that is at a car dealership. They will only have installed the type that serves the vehicles that they sell. But all of the public charging stations that you see have charging stations or charging plugs for each type. So we've had some questions about how do you go on a trip? How do you charge on the go? The good news is that there's a lot more charging available than most people realize. I went to a national tracker, which is the Alternative Fuels Data Center out of the Department of Energy yesterday, to see how many charging stations there are in New York. And as of yesterday, there are 1,800 stations with over 5,000 charging outlets in New York. This is a screenshot from a resource called PlugShare, which we highly recommend. So in the public charging space, there are a bunch of different companies that are competing for you, the electric vehicle customer. And each one of them runs its own network of charging stations. So one you might have heard of is called ChargePoint. They're pretty big in the Northeast. So if you go to ChargePoint's website, you can see all of ChargePoint's charging stations and find one for you to use. But they have competitors. So one of them, for example, is called EVgo. And there, if you go to EVgo's website, you can see all of their charging stations. We like PlugShare because it's platform neutral, it's crowdsourced, and you can see all of those charging stations on one map. So if you go in, you can set search parameters, so you can look for only certain types of chargers or only free chargers or things like that. And then you can plug in any address and they'll generate a map like this where you can see what the charging is available. This is a screenshot that I took where everything that's orange is a DC fast charger. Everything that's green is a level 2 charger. There's actually more chargers than this. This is one of those websites where if you zoom in, more detail pops up. So I would really encourage you to go play around with the website. But what's really wonderful about PlugShare is that because it's crowdsourced, there's lots of information. So you can click on any one of these and find out exactly where it is, exactly what the cost is. A lot of them are free, but some of them do ask for a payment by kilowatt hour or a payment by hours spent charging. All of that detail is there. Often there's pictures so that if you know, for example, that there's a charging station at the Walmart, you can look at the picture to figure out exactly which part of the giant parking lot the charging station is in, although it's usually pretty easy to find. But it's just a really friendly resource, both for electric vehicle drivers and also people who are thinking about going electric, because you can play around with it and see what's available. They do also now have a trip planning feature. So if you put in a starting point and an end point, it'll map out a route for you and ask you how far off of your driving route you're willing to drive to find charging. And then they'll show you what's available and kind of map that out for you. So that is definitely something I would recommend playing around with if there are particular places that you know that you drive to regularly and you want to make sure that you could get there. So again, the website is called PlugShare. It's also available as an app, and I would definitely recommend that you play around with it. The super exciting news is that the amount of charging that is available is poised to increase dramatically over the next couple of years. So in upstate New York specifically, National Grid has been helping to install charging stations at workplaces, multi-unit dwellings, so apartment buildings and condos, and public-facing sites for a couple of years. And just last week, the Public Services Commission in New York directed utilities to really expand programs like that over the next couple of years. So there are hundreds of millions of dollars that will be going into expanding public charging networks, which will just make it more and more easy for more people to switch to electric vehicles in the coming years. So that's something exciting to look out for. I'll pause again before I go into how to get an electric car to see if we've gotten any more questions, but I'm cognizant of the fact that there's only a couple of minutes left, and I want to make sure you guys are free to go at one. So there's a question about some chargers are free, how that works. So yes, there are many chargers that are free because institutions have installed them as a way to attract more customers. So sometimes this is a municipal parking lot, like at a town hall or a city hall. Sometimes this is libraries, sometimes this is malls. It really depends, because the way that most of these network operators work is that they will install the charging station and put it on their network, but the site itself gets to decide how much to charge. So if you want to figure out what that would mean for you specifically, I would go to PlugShare, plug in your address, and see what's around you and see what you could use most frequently and whether those are free stations or not. There's another question about how much electricity the average EV uses and how that will impact your utility bills. That is unfortunately a question that I have to answer with it depends, because it depends on which car you choose and how much you drive. What I would highlight is that if you have an electric vehicle and you charge at home, your electric bill will absolutely go up because you're going to be using more electricity. How much it goes up, again, depends on how much you drive. But the key point is that it will go up by less than your gas bill will go down, because it is cheaper to drive a mile on electricity than it is to drive a mile on gas. So if you have specific questions on that, let's talk about your specific situation offline. But in general, yes, your electricity bill will go up, but ultimately you will save because you'll be spending less on gas. There's a question about what happens if you live in an apartment and you don't have access to charging and you live on the second floor. What do you do? So there are a couple of options. First, I would go to PlugShare and see what's available around you. So we have a couple of easy ambassadors who have electric vehicles but live in a place where they can't charge, and they make do by charging at their gym and at their supermarket, and that's enough for them. It depends on how much you drive, but one thing that is always an option is getting a plug-in hybrid where, yes, you can charge at public charging around you, but you do have a backup gas tank if and when you need it. One thing I do want to say loud and clear is that you should never use an extension cord to plug in your car. That is not safe, so don't do that. But you'll likely be surprised by the fact that there is charging around you that you weren't immediately aware of. Okay, looks like those are all the questions, so I will go quickly to the how to get an electric car section. So I've mentioned a couple of times that I work on this program called Drive Green with National Grid and that we have a website. This is what it looks like. So it is intended both to help you learn about electric vehicles and get all of your questions answered, but then also help facilitate the process of actually getting into one of these cars. So when you get to this website, you can do a couple of things. First, you can, you can click on this menu and you can learn more about all of the topics that I just talked about. So whether that's purchase and lease incentives or charging or any of these other things, you can click on these things and learn a bunch. And we link both to our own resources and external resources if you want to dive deep into any of these particular topics. But when you're ready, you can click this button and you'll come to a list of the vehicles that are generally available for purchase in upstate New York. So you can sort and filter by different characteristics. So if you want to just look at plug-in hybrids that cost less than $40,000, the list will arrange itself for you. Or if you want to look at specifically battery electric vehicles that have over 200 miles of range, you can also do that. This first page of this tool is intended to help you narrow down your choices and figure out what you actually want to test drive and maybe pursue. When you've done that and you've checked off, which car you're interested in and hit next, we'll show you more information about that car specifically. So we'll break down the difference between the different trims. And then when you decide which trim you're interested in, we'll show you dealers that actually have that car available right now. So at the beginning of every month, we go through our roster of dealers and we ask, do you actually have these cars available, or are they available to pre-order if that's interesting to you? The dealers update us. We put that on this website, and then you can come here and you can put in your zip code and figure out which one of these dealers is closest to you. And then we can actually help get you in touch with them. So once you've identified which dealerships you're interested in, you check them off, you hit finish sign up, give us your contact information, and hit submit. And what we do with that information once you've hit submit is that we let the dealer know that you are interested in that particular car. If there are any special discount or pricing programs, we let them know that you're interested in that as well. And then you get a confirmation email from us that says you are interested in these 3 dealerships. Here are the specific electric vehicle salespeople at those dealerships, and here are their phone numbers, so that we can make sure you get connected with somebody at the dealership who is actually interested in selling you these cars and can answer all your questions. We as Green Energy Consumers are still available to help. So if you run into any trouble, have any questions, you can reach out to us by phone or email or even chat, and we're there to facilitate the process and make it as smooth as possible. So with that, we've reached the end of the presentation. We have just a couple minutes left if people do have questions. But first of all, I want to say thank you so much for joining me this afternoon and taking some time to learn about electric cars. And I hope you found the presentation useful. So I will hang on for just a couple minutes to see if I get any more questions. But if not, have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll follow up with an email soon. Looks like there aren't any questions, so I'll go ahead and end this presentation. But thanks again for joining, and I'll follow up soon.